Welcome to This Explainer. Look, right now, President Donald Trump is staring down two massive liabilities that threaten to not just damage the Republican Party in the upcoming midterms, but could literally derail his entire second-term legacy. On one side, you've got this escalating geopolitical powder keg. On the other, an increasingly vulnerable domestic economy. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how these two massive forces are slamming into each other. We'll look at why a standoff halfway across the world is putting incredible, real-world pressure on American voters right here at home. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really wrap our heads around the gravity of the current situation, we have to ask a genuinely fascinating historical question. Could Iran actually decide a U.S. presidential election again? It sounds crazy, but right now, the Islamic Republic is sitting in a spot where they can actively dial up the political pressure on a U.S. leader right before a national election. It is an incredibly high-stakes scenario. And to truly grasp why this is making the current administration sweat, we have to look back at the ghost of elections past, because it's absolutely hanging over the White House right now. The historical parallel here is just undeniable. Think back to 1980. Iran exerted this incredible, almost unprecedented leverage over a U.S. election. They held 52 Americans hostage in Tehran in this grueling standoff that dragged on for 444 days. And a lot of historians will tell you that very crisis was the exact reason Democratic President Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. Well, fast forward to today, and we are looking at a very similar dynamic, just with a different pressure point. Instead of holding hostages, it's the Strait of Hormuz. It's a critical oil exporting route. But the end result? It's exactly the same. The regime has an election season pressure point they can use to make U.S. voters turn on a sitting president, all because of the economic fallout. And here's the thing, President Trump is explicitly aware of this parallel. When he was explaining why he pulled back and didn't order a special forces operation to seize Iranian nuclear material from their underground sites, he literally came out and said, "I didn't want to be Jimmy Carter. I didn't feel like being Jimmy Carter." He was talking about Operation Eagle Claw. That was the disastrous 1980 attempt to free those American hostages. That mission had to be aborted because of bad weather and ended up in a horrific helicopter crash in the Iranian desert that tragically killed 8 servicemen. The president vividly remembers that history, and it is heavily influencing his strategic hesitations today. So the absolutely crucial point here is that while the U.S. is trying to negotiate, Iran is actually digging its heels in and dictating terms to a global superpower. Literally just a week ago, Trump's team was predicting an imminent deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But instead, Tehran hit them with these incredibly tough new conditions. They want an end to the U.S. maritime blockade, the complete departure of all American forces from the region, financial compensation for the war, and a total lifting of sanctions. Obviously, these are terms the Trump administration just cannot accept. So we're left in this high-stakes geopolitical gridlock. Now, let's look at how this builds into real, tangible, domestic economic consequences. Because this isn't just happening on some map in the Middle East. It is happening right at the local gas pump. Thanks to this conflict, the average national gasoline price has surged right back over $4 a gallon, according to AAA. And that is the first big economic domino falling. Voters are starting to feel the direct, everyday impact of this war on their daily commutes, on their wallets, and it is actively souring how they perceive the broader economy. And honestly, the pressure in the energy markets is just mounting by the minute. With hopes of an imminent deal to open the strait fading fast, oil prices have ticked all the way up to $78.49 a barrel. Trump administration officials have repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, stressed that this burden will quickly ease once the strait opens. But paradoxically, their public eagerness to get a deal done might actually be bolstering Iran's negotiating position. It's basically signaling to Tehran exactly how much this is hurting the U.S. president politically. And this brilliantly illustrates the untimely doom loop the GOP finds itself in right now. I mean, energy prices are one thing, but official data released on a Friday showed the economy actually lost 23,000 jobs in July. For a party trying to desperately maintain control with November fast approaching, this is a fresh and frankly devastating blow. The administration is, of course, scanning this data for any silver linings they can find, but voters are just seeing an indifferent reality. It's shaping up to be a pretty dark political environment for Republicans heading into the midterms. What's really striking here is the sheer contrast between that grim reality on the ground and the president's public posture. A lot of his recent weekend social media posts looked, well, almost entirely disconnected from the crisis. While the GOP was digesting this incredibly untimely bad jobs report, the president was posting pictures of himself playing golf with South African legend Gary Player. He was posting about a futuristic drone port on the proposed White House ballroom, and these 2 newly painted golden statues in Washington. It painted a picture of a president who is highly focused on leaving this physical legacy, rather than one brimming with ideas for national economic renewal. And this disconnect, it's having a highly measurable impact on the polls. Analysts, like CNN's Aaron Blake, are pointing out a pretty startling shift. Multiple polls right now show that Trump has completely squandered traditional Republican advantages in two massive areas: national security and the economy. Now, usually, an incumbent party relies heavily on these exact pillars during midterm elections. But now, forced to defend his own record is the actual political establishment, which is very different from his outsider campaigns in 2016 and 2024, the president is finding his party's historical strengths turning into some pretty glaring vulnerabilities. And as you might expect, political opponents are wasting zero time weaponizing these economic struggles. Just take a look at this quote from progressive Michigan Senate nominee Abdul El-Sayed. He argues that there's a responsibility to stand up to Donald Trump for using his power to improve his own family's finances, rather than the voters' finances. Progressives are looking at this and believing these economic vulnerabilities are creating a massive breakthrough opportunity. They're targeting voters who not only disdain Trump, but who also feel totally left behind by the moderate Democratic establishment after the failed campaigns of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The White House, however, is aggressively pushing back on that entire narrative. Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, defended the administration by flat-out stating that the overall economy is really, really booming. And when he was pressed on those 23,000 lost jobs in July, Hassett argued that the numbers merely reflected the end of temporary work from the World Cup finals and teachers just taking the month of July off. The administration absolutely insists the economy is fundamentally resilient, that it's creating high-quality jobs, and that prices are, in fact, moderating. Now, what's really interesting here is the massive disconnect it reveals. Calibrating economic messaging is incredibly tricky in politics. While the White House perceives this sort of economic golden age, the voters' everyday reality is entirely different. Regular Americans are dealing with high food prices, high housing prices, wages that are just lagging behind, and they're severely struggling with healthcare affordability. This gap between the rhetoric of a booming economy and the actual financial squeeze everyday people are feeling is a perennial political trap, and it's one the current administration seems to be falling right into. But despite all of this, the tough Iranian demands, the soaring gas prices, the lost jobs, the president remains remarkably publicly unfazed. In an interview with Axios, he claimed, "Things will work out. It always works out. It's like a chess game." Trump essentially says they are low-keying it and only semi-negotiating. Basically, after devastating Iran's military and setting back its nuclear program, Trump is betting the house on the U.S. economy's greater endurance. He's gambling that the United States can simply outlast Iran's suffering before the political clock completely runs out in November. Which brings us to the ultimate, totally impenetrable endgame. Analysts note that Iran's radical leaders might actually be far more willing to impose suffering on their own people as they pursue what they see as an existential struggle. A regime collapse? It just seems highly unlikely on Trump's very short political timeline. If Trump loses patience and relaunches the war, he risks a massive economic backlash right before the election. So we are left in this high-stakes standoff where the American economy and an upcoming election completely hang in the balance. In this geopolitical chess game, who actually makes the final move? Thank you for joining this explainer.